Justice is the evaluation of the distribution of benefits and burdens within a society, the way in which people get the goods that they have. So I think a good way of approaching the issue of justice is taking a look at Rawls and the veil of ignorance. So recall with Rawls, the veil of ignorance is that people are born with certain advantages and disadvantages in life, right? Some people are born smarter than others. Some people are born more beautiful than others. Some people are born richer or poorer than others, with better health or worse health. And these are things that are sort of part of a genetic lottery. It's not something we choose, it's not something we have much control over, and we don't get a choice in the matter. There are things we can do, of course, to improve our station once we are born into it. But a lot of things at birth are just the results of this natural lottery. So justice is not so much concerned with those type of traits, the ones that we are born with or the ones that we don't have much control over. Instead, justice is concerned with the choices that are the goods that we do have some choice or some control over how they are distributed or to what extent they are distributed. And especially things like healthcare, education, uh, income, other goods that are important for survival, resources. One concept that often gets tied in with justice and is usually associated with conversations in justice is equality. We think of justice being people being treated equally, things being equal. They're heavily tied together. And a theory of equality, when we're thinking about, well, what does it mean to be equal? Or what exactly is equality in society? Theories of equality are those theories that identify or try to identify the goods and absence of burdens that ought to be equally distributed in society and specify the amount of units or the number of units to whom those goods or absence of burdens should be equally distributed. It's important here to note that not all inequality is going to be morally relevant. One example the text uses is the mortality average age between men and women, the difference. I think on average, men die 5 years younger than women. If this isn't something that is influenced socially, it's not something that is for any societal reason. Rather, it's something biological. Men, perhaps I don't know the science here, but if there's some genetic or biological reason that men die on average 5 years younger, then that's not going to be morally relevant because for equality or theories of equality, because there's nothing that society can really change to make it more equal, to bring the average ages more in line with each other. It's something that is just a biological difference. And we could probably look at a whole host of other characteristics that probably honestly fall on a spectrum between something society can completely control and something they have society has no control over. So theories of equality will probably apply to at degrees for a lot of qualities. Like, for example, something like beauty. There's a certain amount of beauty that you're just born with, right? Maybe she's born with it or whatever. But maybe it's Maybelline, right? Maybe it's something that society can control. Maybe it's the distribution of wealth such that this person can afford better healthcare or exercise or body modifications, whether it's like makeup or fashion or whatever, right? Those things influence beauty and are to an extent socially controlled. So maybe beauty falls somewhere in between something that we have no control over and something that we do have control over. Because in addition to thinking about the distribution of goods and burdens, there's also the fact that like there are certain maybe standards of beauty that different parts of society apply at different cultural areas, perhaps. So you can see that there's a spectrum here, right? And theories of equality might notice that spectrum and try and hone in on which goods or absences of burdens society can really affect. And this is something that Dworkin tries, or he's trying to get at what is equality based on? Is it based on people being equally happy? Is it based on welfare? Or is it based on something about the distribution of, or rather, how many goods people have? And Dworkin thinks it can't be based on welfare because it involves too many subjective evaluations, and too many subjective evaluations that we're likely to get wrong about how happy something makes us or how happy something will make us, right? Remember this, diminishing marginal utility. You might think that eighth beer is going to make you really happy, but you're probably wrong about it, especially if you've had seven already, right? But the thought is that we have these, when we're making evaluations about how happy some additional good or how happy some amount of goods is going to make us, uh, we're probably going to be, uh, there's a margin of error at least, right? If we're not going to be outright incorrect. Um, and the millionaire who's unhappy because their neighbor is, has $3 million and they only have two. Um, they're probably their unhappiness is probably uh, out of the realm of reality for most people, right? Most people think that they're being unhappy with not having as much as their neighbor is probably irrational, or maybe not irrational, but it fails to recognize the subjective situation they're in, that the fact they already have $2 million, right? And instead, he thinks it has to be something about resource equality. And he thinks that it's not that everyone needs to get an equal number, because that disregards people's preferences for different goods, or how much they'd be willing to pay for certain goods. And this is why he introduces this concept of a Walrasian auction, which is an auction that we don't need to go into too many economic specifics here. One, because it's really the outcome is simple. It's just that supply and demand are equal across all people. So you ask each individual what they're willing to pay for a certain good, and you make sure that once everyone's preferences are accumulated and logged, that there is exactly the amount of supply that there is for demand. And if you match those, then you have equal access to goods, or you have for Dworkin, the importance here is that everyone has equal access to the goods that they want and they're willing to pay a certain price for, right? And so it's not that everyone needs, to make it really simple, 3 loaves of bread and 2 apples, but everyone needs the access to get as many apples as they're willing to pay for and as much bread as they're willing to pay for. And so the thought here is, instead of thinking about equality of resource units, it's instead the equality of resource access. And so this is Dworkin's point to equality. When trying to think about how we ought to distribute these goods and these burdens in society, we can look to different theories of justice. A theory of justice is a theory that attempts to present, defend, and critique standards used to judge the social distribution of benefits and burdens. So, what does this mean? Well, I think it's best to look at some examples of theories of justice. We got a few in this chapter. We'll start with one that we should already have some familiarity with in utilitarianism. Recall that as an ethical theory, utilitarianism argues that what is good, or what is morally good, is what brings the most amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, following this greatest happiness principle. Or also what reduces the amount of suffering to the most amount of people, right? It's a balance of the reduction of suffering and the bringing of pleasure or happiness. And utilitarianism as a theory of justice is very similar. It argues that what is just is a social life or a social structure that makes the most people happy and reduces the suffering of the most people. I'm going to use shorthand here for just makes the most people happy, but always remember when I say that, I'm also meaning the reduction of suffering too. That's a very important point that sometimes might get glossed over when thinking about utilitarianism. When applying it to justice, one key terminology here is, or one key part of the theory is this idea of diminishing marginal utility. What is diminishing marginal utility? Well, I think a good way of looking at it is imagine drinking beer, right? I like drinking beer. The first one is usually really good. It brings me a lot of pleasure. I like the taste of it. If it does calm me down a little bit, it's delicious, it's refreshing. But each subsequent beer after is going to have what's diminishing returns. In other words, every time I add one beer or add one more good, I'm getting less and less utility from that additional unit. So I can think about it. If my first beer is, say, 10 units of happiness, my second one might be 8, my third one might be 5, 4, and it's going to go lower and lower, right? Especially with beer, you can really see this as it gets to the point of drunkenness and pain and sickness, right? And the diminishing marginal utility of goods is very important to a theory of justice for utilitarianism because it says that once someone has a certain amount of goods, say a billionaire, right, with money, uh, adding an extra million onto their billions is probably going to have it's very diminished compared to maybe their first $1 million, right? And you can see this with a bunch of different goods, things that are necessary for survival, things like healthcare, things like education. All of these goods can be looked at under the scope of diminishing marginal utility and examined for the fairest or most just distribution. In this case, fair and just for a utilitarian is going to refer to that which makes the most people happy. So thinking about, say, great income indisparity for utilitarian, they might think that's not just because the person who has $2 billion or something is getting much less utility from their last million than someone who has nothing. And maybe we should be distributing that more fairly such that it makes more people happy. And this is a utilitarian view of justice, right? It applies this concept of diminishing marginal utility and looks at the types of goods that society distributes and says, well, how can we distribute those such that it makes the most people happy? Social contract theory is another theory of justice that argues what is just is what was agreed to in the social contract or a unanimous agreement among those living in a community. This means that as long as everyone gets together and agrees, maybe like a really, really large constitutional convention where everyone gets to have their input and agree to this set of rules, that is what is just. Now, usually social contract theory is applied in a more abstract way. It's not what people actually come together and agree to. It's what people in a position of, something like the veil of ignorance. Like they're looking at constructing a society, they don't know where exactly they're going to fall. What would maybe a group of those people looking at it from that perspective, what would they choose? And here, I mean, social contract theory definitely had some influence on, say, the United States of America, right? The consent of the governed is very important in ruling, and the fact that we all agreed in principle to this. Look, we didn't now agree, right? We were born into this, but people originally set up this constitution. They all agreed to it. They signed into it, and the thought is they have set up the rules and they've consented to those rules, and therefore they apply to them and they are just to apply to them. And this social contract theory might expand to, it does expand to the distribution of goods and burdens rather than just laws. Laws help the distribution of goods and burdens, but that's not the only thing, right? Things like the tax code also apply here, right? Or things like how we set up our universities or how we set up our public schools. And social contract theory is going to say that what makes it just is not something like what makes the most people happy. It's instead what people agree to and commit themselves to in a contract, a social contract among citizens or individuals of a community. Another theory of justice is libertarianism. Libertarianism has a strain in US politics, right? We have a libertarian party, and the libertarian view of justice is very similar to the fundamental principles of the libertarian party, in that it accepts that freedom is the most important social value. And so a just state is a state that allows people to pursue the freedom that they want without infringing on the freedom of others. There's a role for governmental action in protecting that freedom or defending it, but any governmental action which restricts freedom should be either outright dismissed or not taken, or it should be looked at with a lot of scrutiny on the libertarian view. And how does this libertarian view fit into the consumption or the accumulation of goods and burdens? And Nozick has that a view of ownership of goods, and it is when the following three conditions are fulfilled. First, the goods are natural and nobody ever owned them. This means that something like if you were going to say dig for oil or try and drill into the ground to find oil, nobody owns that oil. But once someone drills into it and is able to take it out of the ground and has a maybe an operation set up to continuously do this, Nozick thinks they have a claim to that portion or that range of natural goods. And this means nobody owns something like the sun, right? Or nobody owns something like the air or certain features of the environment, right? You might buy a plot of land, but you don't own land that, say, no one ever purchased. The second condition is that people may voluntarily trade to acquire goods. They may trade money for items. They may trade goods for other goods, services for goods, etc., etc. And third, and finally, people have a right to rectify past acquisitions if they were not appropriate. And third, and finally, people have a right to rectify past acquisitions if they were not appropriate. Meaning, if people were stolen from, or if someone laid claim to something that they really shouldn't have laid claim to, we can rectify that. You can pursue, say, through courts, through the justice system to try and recuperate what you lost or what was taken from you. Now, there's a lot of complications here, right? And Nozick has a huge, plethora of work from him delineating these conditions and when they apply and when they don't apply. But for us, we can see the general scope of the view. It says, look, let's not let government have too much say in the distribution of goods and resources, because what's most important and what's most valuable is human freedom. And any way in which the government infringes on that is going to be negative. So unless it's to defend someone the freedom of others, right? This is why you're not just free to go and hurt someone on a libertarian view because you're infringing on their freedom to pursue their own ends, their own goods. And that's not going to fly in a libertarian society. So that's the general scope of libertarianism. The idea is human freedom is the most important value, and we should use the government, or the government should be there and exist to protect that human freedom. The good that we are chiefly concerned with here in this chapter and in this course is the distribution of healthcare. Healthcare is a service that is offered by professionals, and it falls under this category of how do we distribute healthcare among people in our society in the most just way? What is the just way to allocate healthcare? And we have some models here that are given to us in this chapter. The first is the proprietary model. This is a model that says, look, healthcare is just like any other service. It is provided by professionals or people who pursue this line of work, and their services are theirs to market as they will and to charge what they want and what they think they can get on the open market. And of course, it's the customer's choice whether or not to pursue that, whether or not they want to pay that much for their goods. But this model says basically it should act like any other market. And we shouldn't give special consideration to healthcare. There are some reasons to think this might not be the best way to think about healthcare as a service. Undoubtedly, it's a service, but there are these three criterion that make it seem quite different from, say, house cleaning services. One, they're necessary for life. in order to live successfully, you need healthcare. If you get really sick, or if you get severely injured, or even if you are healthy, general checkups are important and for prolonging your life and living a more healthy life. Second, people are generally not knowledgeable enough to be fully rational consumers of healthcare. This is either because they don't have enough information about healthcare, or they're in the midst of being sick and they can't, they go to the doctor and the doctor says, look, I can, help alleviate this pain, but I'm going to need $2,000. Someone in a lot of pain might not be able to rationally weigh the considerations here. Well, $2,000 is a lot of money, and they're just going to give me like Tylenol or something, right? That's not going to be a rational choice. They're making it under duress. And three, the education of healthcare providers is subsidized by public investment to a large extent. The government contributes to the education of individuals in the healthcare field. And the fact that this is subsidized by the public means that it shouldn't just be like a house cleaning service where their training isn't provided by the government or any other service, right? Instead, we should have some governmental or public oversight in how this service is run. Another model about how to distribute healthcare in the most just way is the merit model. This model argues that those who deserve care ought to receive it. Maybe we reward those who are well behaved, or those who are in good health, or those who make healthy choices, and we give those people healthcare. This has the benefits of incentivizing making healthy choices, right? If you provide healthcare to people who make healthy choices, maybe it's going to incentivize more people to act healthily. And it will decentivize making poor health choices. It will decentivize acting unhealthily, right? That's a good thing, maybe. And it's a good thing to spurn this acting in a healthy way among people. Perhaps you can think of some ways in which this might be problematic. One, who determines exactly what is acting healthily, or what is meritorious, right? What deserves merit and what doesn't? How are these standards going to be applied to people? Or how are they going to make sure that they are applied fairly? Are they going to be doctors interviewing patients? What if the health problems that someone is suffering is not due to any of their choices? What if it's something genetic, or something, or I should say hereditary, that they have in their family? What if it just happens to them by accident? They're engaged in an accident. The AMA, the American Medical Association, says, look, the merit model is not a great way to distribute healthcare, because it's usually it's not only hard to determine what criterion are deserving of merit and what are not, but also it's hard to apply those standards fairly across an entire population. And the social worth model we'll go over here is similar. It says, look, the idea that those who deserve care ought to receive it. We maybe, people who take good care of themselves, or people who are deemed socially worthy of it, maybe people who are vulnerable in certain ways. But this is, again, like the merit model. It's hard to figure out, first of all, what the standards are, and second, how to apply them. So those are the two that they say, here are these ethical standards, and we ought to apply those when we allocate healthcare. And the difficulty with these models, of course, is, again, hard to know what the criterion are, and two, even harder to apply those fairly to an entire population. Lastly, really quick, I just want to mention the feminist and just healthcare. This is really, it's a broad view of how to approach justice in general, and applying it to healthcare specifically is an interesting project. But we can sort of just back up and think about what feminist ethics and their applications in justice are looking at, and they're looking at patterns and of discrimination and patterns of oppression, how different groups are treated in society based on something like their sex, their gender, their racial identity, their physical or mental ability or disabilities. All of these sorts of considerations are factored in, and justice is evaluated under the scope of these social inequalities, these social forms of oppression or social justice issues. And when approached to healthcare, you can already imagine some of the implications here, right? How women are treated in healthcare, how things like reproductive rights are looked at or viewed by the general public. And these sorts of considerations are going to be huge in a feminist approach to justice and the allocation of healthcare. Lastly, I just want to take a look at some of the policy options for healthcare. I'm not going to go over the stuff that they do about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act because, while interesting, I don't think it's a lot of fact throwing at you, and it's not a lot of necessarily philosophical work. So I think you can read that without me just parroting it back to you. But I will briefly here go over the different policies of the allocation of healthcare. One, we have the fee-for-service model. This is just like it's one way to implement the proprietary model, and that healthcare professionals set a price for their services, and people that are able to pay get healthcare. Those that are unable to pay do not get that service. So this would be sort of a bare bones capitalist way of looking at the healthcare market, thinking that it is a service just like any other, and it ought to follow the same market principles of any other service. Another model to look at is the universal and comprehensive provisions of benefits model. And this is universal healthcare to the max, we'll say. It is a universal healthcare that provides all of the healthcare services to all of its citizens. It is not just that some people with the means might be able to afford the fancier or better healthcare, but every standard of care has to be universal. Has to be applied to all of the citizens of that country or that whatever governmental body is using this type of healthcare model. A less extreme version of that universal healthcare, or a perhaps less financially burdensome version of that healthcare, is the universal basic healthcare model. This says, well, we need to provide a basic level of care, and this would be a standard set by, either the government itself or some regulatory group of that government, right? Or maybe a panel of doctors that is advising the government. Together, they would come up with some standards that are basic, like doctor visits, certain routine procedures, maybe an emergency room stop, something like that, that qualify as basic. And these would be applied to everyone. They'd be universal across all of the people in that community, while others who may have more means or may elect to use their means in a certain way would be able to get fancier or non-basic medical provisions and services, things that maybe are elective or things that are not used every day would be, you'd have the option of getting that service for a fee. So it's a in between this fee for service model and this universal comprehensive provisions model that's everything gets provided to everyone. So this is a in between, and we can see sort of the spectrum here. On the one hand, we have here's medical services. They're just like any other service. We should let the open market dictate how they are distributed. And then on the other side, we have no, healthcare services are not only unlike any other service, but they're basic, maybe a basic human right, and they should be afforded to everyone in every capacity. And we have, of course, a wide range of middle ground in between those two polar ends. And that's how, those are some different policy options for how to allocate healthcare. So in this video, we looked at some of the different ways that people have approached theories of justice, what exactly the difference between justice and equality is, and we've looked at different ways to allocate healthcare. And in doing so, we've looked at what is the just way to distribute healthcare? What is the way that a society that is just would decide to distribute it. And how would we make that decision? Well, here's some theories of justice we just looked at that might help guide making policy decisions about healthcare. And that will be all for the video today. I want you guys to go ahead and go do the discussion board post if you haven't already. I'm asking you about, is healthcare a basic human right, or is it something else? Is it something like a service that just needs to be, perhaps it's not the service like any other. Perhaps there is something different about it, but it's still just a service in the end, maybe. I'm interested to hear your thoughts here, and make sure you do the quiz, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.